Great, Mr. Well, thanks again for taking the time to speak with us here over at Betway. First things first, the draft was definitely a sight to see. Definitely, I know some people say it was a lot of intrigue. My question is, if you had to pick one team, or maybe even two, that you felt that won the draft on Thursday through Saturday.
It's a good question. I mean, I think the Bears are maybe getting overlooked a little bit just because that trade happened, a month or two ago, and we kind of lose sight that they got a lot of value. They got a really good receiver. They're able to, stay or get to number 9. And I think traded down with Philly one pick and pick up a little more draft capital and still, pick a pretty good player at 10. So I think Chicago did a good job of, most of the smart people say as long as you can trade down, you can accumulate more picks. And Chicago was in that perfect opportunity to do it. And when you look back and you think, oh, maybe they could have held on to the number 1 pick and waited for something else to materialize. People were talking about, oh, maybe trade with Houston at 2 and then being able to, trade back from 2. It didn't really seem like that number 2 pick market kind of bared out the way we thought it would. And Houston was, rumored to want to trade down. Ended up trading up to 3 to grab their guy in Anderson. But I think Chicago was, smart to kind of do that trade when they did, and they got a lot of value, and then did another trade down, and were able to pick up some more picks. And I think I would look at them. I still think Carolina, as much as they gave up, they got the best player in the draft, in my opinion, in Bryce Young. We talked last time about, him being that outlier in terms of the physical stature and the height, weight, and all that. But still think he's a heck of a player. Played in the SEC against, some big dudes who are getting drafted in the first round alongside him. And I think he only missed 1 game in his career, so he's been able to be durable so far. A lot of people are talking about Philly being able to get Jalen Carter, who, quote unquote, drops a bit from maybe top 3, top 5 into that 9 spot where Philly went up and took him, and Nolan Smith as well, getting him at 30, not having to come up and do it. I push back on that a little bit. I think if, you have 2 guys who a team says did a great job of waiting to let the board come to them and drafting them, I would say, why did they get to those spots? I think we go a little bit overboard with falling in love with certain players in the draft process, and we see all these mock drafts and all these boards, and guys are, Carter's the number 1 defensive talent in the draft, and Nolan Smith, probably in the teens on most people's boards, and they get picked at 9 and 30, and the question is why. And everyone's saying Philly had an amazing first round and this and that, and I'd say maybe they didn't necessarily get the greatest value out of taking guys who are slipping. So Philly's a common one that we see in terms of the best picks, and I would say I'm a little more lukewarm on them than maybe everybody else is.
No, another one to me, I think, is Detroit. I know a lot of people were giving them some leeway because of the where they were picking, and obviously they picked a running back first. But I like the pick. I thought that Jahmyr Gibbs is a heck of a talent. I think he's a stud. To me, that was just a great pick. Jack Campbell out of Iowa, can't go wrong with anybody from Iowa. So I think that they did a heck of a job as well. But no, I agree. I think a lot of the teams that you picked, I think many are going to be picking the same way. Now, more even as we can say possible, but we had a lot of intrigue, right? A lot of interesting people who slipped, who may have went in the first round, that many people didn't. Was there any big surprises? I know we had the Will Levis, 2 running backs got drafted here in the first round. Anything that surprised you coming from a day 1 pick?
I think you hit on it. The Gibbs pick is a bit surprising to see him get taken at 12, and he even admitted as much after the fact. He was kind of getting ready to get picked in that 20 to 31 range, where most of the top running backs that aren't seen as a transcendent guy, quite like Bijan was, tend to get picked. And just understanding the value of that position, and being able to draft guys who are quote unquote more premium in terms of the edge rushers and the offensive tackles and the QBs and receivers, and even corners a bit in that first round as the value picks. So I do think seeing that second running back at number 12 was a surprise. I don't think if we left the draft and we said 2 guys were picked in the first round, most people would say, yeah, that makes sense. Bijan went in the top 15 and Gibbs probably went in the late 20s. But if we say, 2 running backs were picked at 8 and at 12, and one of those is Gibbs, I think that's where the shock and the surprise tends to come out a little bit more. But there's 2 sides to every coin. If you look at him as a pure running back, then you could say, yeah, maybe, Lions reached a little bit for that. If you look at him as someone who might get played in one of those roles where you're getting jet sweeps, you're getting throwing the ball in the passing game, you're maybe a little bit more in the McCaffrey with San Francisco mold, where a team is really creative. And Detroit's offense last year was awesome. They were super creative, and they're able to, do a lot with a really good offensive line, with Goff, who's, shown he can play some good football when all the pieces are right around him. They got St. Brown at receiver and some other guys. So if you look at him as, one of these positionless weapon guys, and maybe he's able to play some running back, he's able to play some receiver. I don't think you'd look quite as harshly on him as the 12th overall pick, but because he is, a running back at the end of the day, and he's probably going to get his 15 carries, it's seen as, kind of a negative pick. But I would say, honestly, I mean, Houston taking Stroud, I was surprised by, just because you didn't see that quite as much. We heard a lot about, well, it's Will Anderson, it's maybe Tyree Wilson, it's potentially trading back, it's Will Levis got to like even odds to be the number 2 overall pick, and all of a sudden they take Stroud, who's the guy that most people thought that they should have taken in that spot. And then right after that, they trade back up and they draft Will Anderson, give up a lot to go do that. And so I was pretty surprised by, picks 2 and 3. And, I love football. I love watching all the stuff. I love watching the coverage of it. And everyone kind of says like, this is my mock draft, or this is what I think is going to happen. But pick 2 could throw that all out the window, depending on what Houston does. So they kind of threw a lot of that out the window. They took the quarterback, and not the one everyone thought, given the rumors. And then they traded up and took the defensive end that everyone did think they would take it too. So I think that was kind of the jumping off point for a frantic and wild first round. And so it was really fun from there.
No, definitely. I think everyone mentioned, right, that the draft starts at number 2. What does Houston do? And it was great to see. I'm sure Stroud was a little nervous when he saw that Houston traded, and he was like, "Wait a minute, are they trading me?" And and he moves back. They move up to grab a defensive guy. And speaking of quarterbacks, I know it's really hard, with any player, right, to project where they're going to succeed. Depending on where they pick. Obviously, as you know, it all very circumstantial. But in your mind, which quarterback do you believe will have success either in the short term or long term by where they got picked?
I do like the Stroud pick. You look at that offensive coordinator comes from San Francisco, and obviously Kyle Shanahan is kind of the genius, but they brought in Greasy last year as the quarterbacks coach, San Francisco did. And so I think it's Slowick is able to kind of watch and learn from, Kyle for a few years. He's able to see Greasy turn, Mr. Irrelevant Brock Purdy into this, 10 game in a row winner or whatever it was. So you're able to absorb all these different things. You have an offense that, historically has been a little bit easier on the quarterback. And then you've got Stroud, who has played at a high level in college and, played in a lot of big games. So it's a pretty good marriage of, scheme, a coordinator who's been around some other guys, who's developed some guys himself, and also the quarterback being a good player in college. I do like Love. I mean, honestly, all 3 of these guys fell into really good spots, because you look at Frank Reich, and he's, kind of a noted quarterback developer and guru. And even as much as we want to make fun of the Carson Wentz pick, like, he had a pretty good season with, the Colts in terms of what his other seasons around those or that one looked like. And so you look at the Washington year, you look at the Philly year before, and the Indy one stands out as like, yeah, that's the outlier of the 3 years. And that was the year he got to work with Reich. So I think that's a good marriage. And Reich likes to run the RPOs. He likes to do a lot of the stuff, Bryce Young is good at. Alabama was running. So I think that's going to be a really smart and impactful marriage. And then Richardson, again, goes to Indy. Steichen, who just developed Jalen Hurts and created this beautiful offense around him. And obviously Sirianni is part of that as well. So in a lot of ways, this is almost the most optimistic I've been about, the 3 quarterbacks going in the top 4 picks in a while, because there's no, like, yeah, this team is bad and the coordinator's bad and they don't really have a plan to develop him. Like, you're able to get into 3 different spots with guys who have proven that they've been around and or developed quarterbacks at multiple locations, and the talent might not be around them like at the highest level. I would say Houston probably has the least talent of those 3 teams, but I do think the surrounding nature of what they're building, and you could probably argue Houston offensive line wise is right up there with those 3 groups. So I just like the fit for all of them, and that makes me excited, because good quarterback play is the catalyst of the NFL. It's the catalyst of good football and fun football, and these guys have all shown that they can be electric, and I would definitely like to see that in the pros.
Yeah, I agree. I think that I'm excited to see all three and how they play. And I think all three are going to have a really chip on their shoulder. I know many people think you're the number one pick. Well, how could you have a chip on your shoulder like that? And I think that many people talked about Bryce Young and his how he's going to survive, especially with his height wise. And I feel like all three of those guys had something negative said about them. And I think they're going to, hey, I'm going to prove you guys wrong. I'm going to prove that I should have been the best player taken and why Bryce Young is and Anthony Richardson, who maybe didn't have a lot of sample size. So definitely, I think it's going to be a fun one for these three quarterbacks this season. And speaking of quarterbacks, we all know, in many people's opinion, Patrick Mahomes, right? The if not the best quarterback, right? Um, it, do you believe that Kansas City is, after given everything with the draft, free agency, do you still believe that Kansas City is the number one pick to go and win the Super Bowl? Or is there a team that you felt like coming out of this draft and out of the free agency, hey, they can knock this team out?
No, I still think it's Kansas City. I think, we all learned our lesson after this past year. I mean, I say we, I don't necessarily put myself into that category because as a, KC homer, I still like the Chiefs to come out of the AFC and win it all. And sure enough, they did. But I think, we as a collective learned our lesson that as long as Mahomes is there, as long as, the O-line is pretty good or better, for the foreseeable future, as long as KELCE's there, this is going to be the best team in the AFC. The infrastructure that Coach Reid has built, that, Pat has now built, that's the best tandem in the conference. And again, you're better off just betting them and, just assuming that they're going to be the best team. Now, it's not going to happen every year. Like that's, these things happen. And I would say injuries are probably the biggest thing going against, any team who's projected to be, as good or the best team. We saw that with Buffalo. I mean, they were the kind of consensus best team last year, for good reason. They had a top 5 offense and a top 5 defense, and they looked amazing. I mean, they started the year and everything was clicking and all those guys. And, slowly they started to get injured and, Von Miller gets hurt. And, he was the guy they brought in a free agency to be kind of the catalyst along the defensive line, especially. They had put a lot of first and second round picks into the defensive line. And, Von gets hurt and he's not able to be out there. And all of a sudden the injuries started to pile up for them. And so, could that happen to Kansas City or any other team? Of course, but I think looking based on now free agency and the draft, I still think Kansas City is the way to go. And the defense is continuing to improve every year. That's the thing that's the most exciting for me as a Kansas City fan. Is the offense again is always going to be probably top 5 in the NFL, as a minimum. This year the receiving group is the, quote unquote downside of the offense, but still a lot of good players. And, again, I trust, get the most out of it. But if you're able to put a top 5 offense with now a top 10, a top 12 defense instead of a defense in the 20s or in the low teens, like historically we have been the past 5 years, now all of a sudden that team's floor is much higher because you can go into any week, and we see this in December and January of the past few years of Chiefs football. The defense kind of turns the screws down and becomes, in those 2 months, a top 12, a top 10, top 8 defense. And with the baseline of talent and ability of the offense, it just makes them a much more well-rounded group and a much more well-rounded team. So I think it definitely has to be Kansas City.
I know many Jet fans here in the New York, New Jersey area are hoping that's not the case. With Aaron
Yeah, I
Rodgers
mean,
coming.
I understand the reason to get excited about it. Rodgers had a quote unquote down year for him last year. I mean, obviously coming off 2 MVPs, like it's hard to have a third MVP at age 38 or 39, whatever it was. He still has the ability. I mean, he can still make the throws. For him, it's more, integrating into that offense with everybody else. Now, obviously Hackett's there to, kind of smooth that transition. It's a guy he's familiar with. It's a terminology and an offense he's familiar with. And the last time he, took a step back was, I think, McCarthy's last year in Green Bay, and then LaFleur comes and he wins 2 MVPs. So, the last time we kind of doubted him and is the game slipping, he turned it around in a big way. And I think that's what, all the Jets fans are banking on. And I do think there's going to be an uptick from last year, assuming he stays healthy. But that defense, that's where things are a little more variable. I think we're all just assuming it's going to be like a top 5 defense, and, Salah's got them all fired up and motivated. But year to year, defense is more variable in the NFL than offense. So, I think it's difficult to assume from the Jets perspective that you're just going to have a top 5 defense. And like we just talked about Kansas City, you'd like to think the offense is top 10, and even if the defense regresses, it's still top 10. So if you got two top 10 units, it should be pretty good. So I get the optimism, but obviously, if you're living around it, it's going to be a little more positive than maybe a realistic outlook.
Oh yeah, definitely. That's all everyone here is talking about. Just a couple more questions. I know, listen, you've had a time here in the Cleveland Browns, and the AFC North is always competitive. With the news now that Lamar Jackson signing back with Baltimore, are they the favorites? Is it Cincinnati? Do you believe that the Browns may have pushed that limit? Who do you think is coming out of that AFC North this year?
I think at this point the Browns are, the third team. I think Pittsburgh's probably looking at them as the fourth, kind of depending on what Pickett can do. And it's hard to bet against Pittsburgh with Tomlin's record and with the defense the way it is. And they just seem to keep plugging away and, kind of win that 8, 9, 10 games every year, regardless. From the Cleveland perspective, not as much draft capital this year, but still did a pretty good job of getting some guys that, people thought were good players, and, going back to that consensus board type of thing, but getting guys who maybe were, in the 50s to 75 range in the, I think Cleveland's first pick was 74, and then going down from there. So getting good players in that third, fourth round range, which is, a lot of good value in the draft. But it kind of comes back to the quarterback, and, if he plays the way he played last year, then that's going to be the worst team in the division. If he plays better, then, we'll see what happens. But, if I was a Cleveland fan, I wouldn't be super optimistic right now, just based on, what we've seen and the contract and the draft capital given to him.
Yeah, it's going to definitely be interesting. And how can you go against Joe Burrow, in that division? I think that's going to be tough to beat them, to knock them off. Last question. We saw at the very beginning, right? Travis KELCE there in Kansas City having fun. Being his teammate, I'm sure have a lot of great stories. Is there one in particular that stands out to you, as you were with him, when you were meeting him and playing with him? Is there something that pops out that you can tell our listeners and viewers?
I mean, the stories and what you can tell stories are maybe a little bit different, but I think the thing with him is, now that we know him as more of kind of this personality and, hosting SNL and doing all these cool things, obviously we know the football player that he is, what he's able to do on the field in terms of, catching the ball and the receptions and the yards and the touchdowns and all that, and the catalyst he is for that offense. We learned that especially with, Tyreek getting traded last year. The thing that always sticks out to me is just the mental ability to just understand football. He was a quarterback in college for a little bit, and I don't know if it's that. I don't know if it's just a natural ability. I mean, some guys are born with it, but when I first got to Kansas City, I mean, he's awesome dude. We love having fun together. And, when you're doing walkthroughs or whatever, and it's a little bit lower pace, kind of tend to joke around in the huddle a little bit more and have your fun. And his ability to, he and I could kind of be talking off to the side. Maybe he's saying something, he doesn't like fully hear the play call, or the quarterback starts the play call, and, he's not totally locked in, but we get to the line of scrimmage. And again, this isn't like a practice or a game, so it's not, happening in real situations, but the ability to kind of be thinking about two different things at once and still hear the play call and still get lined up and still run the right route and find the open space. And I just realized, in those moments, like how brilliant he is as a football player. And that was the thing that always stuck out to me, is just his ability to understand what he needs to do, where he needs to go. And then he finds an identical person like that in Pat. And that's the reason those two guys mesh so well, is because they see the game the same. They have that same kind of brilliant genius level ability to feel the open spaces, to manipulate defenses, to anticipate each other's moves, because they're seeing the game in the same way, and it's in a way that very few people have ever seen the game. So as fun as he is, as cool as he is, as awesome as of a teammate as he is, I still think about that, kind of beautiful, brilliant football mind, and what it must be like for him to just go out there and have everything be super slow motion.
Mitchell, well, thanks again for taking the time to speak with us. We really appreciate it. Thank you again. And yeah, hope you had fun.
Yeah, absolutely. Always good to talk ball with you.